hardback came out in 2019, so well before the COVID pandemic. But yeah, I think if you think about 2016 and all the things that were happening politically then, both here and in the US especially, it didn't feel too far away, this sort of idea of an apocalypse, or this idea of things coming to a head, certainly. I remember watching, it was when the US were really sort of riling, or Donald Trump was riling North Korea, and there were all those big sort of military demonstrations. I remember watching that on TV and thinking, I really need to get on and write this book before it's not fiction anymore. So yeah, I guess things have been escalating in many ways, haven't they, over the past 5, probably 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And is it just current affairs that influenced it, or is it previous books? Is there like a canon of literature that inspired you to write this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of well-established canon of post-apocalyptic literature. I'm thinking about things like The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I'm thinking Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. I'm thinking Octavia Butler's work as well. So there's a kind of canon of post-apocalyptic literature, which I think any book that deals with that is going to draw on, even if only implicitly, because it's become part of our collective sort of psyche. But yeah, I guess it's all part of the mix, isn't it, of the kind of the cocktail of what goes into inspiring a novel, which you're never quite sure what's a direct influence and what's just what you've just sort of brought with you sort of accidentally.
Yeah. Did you want to give us a reading to kick off from the novel? Would that be okay?
Yeah. I guess I'll start by reading the start. It feels like what's the line in The Sound of Music? A very good place to start. So the novel opens with the main character, or one of the main characters. There are two. Monster, basically sitting by a window on Svalbard, where she's there for work, which is a kind of very remote Arctic location, which is part of how she survives everything that kind of happens. And the novel opens with her essentially witnessing the end of the world. When the world is burning, it's easy to forget about ice. Easy for most people, that is. I knew nothing but freeze for over a year. I lived with the ice, on the ice, inside it, locked on the island as the rest of the world grew desperate with rage and disease. As the missiles fell and cities were blasted by 1,000-degree heat, I struggled to keep warm. Frostbite, and a chill so keen it cuts right through the heart. That's the price of survival. Then what? After everyone else was dead, I sat by a window for 3 days watching the glacier creak and break. When I took off my trousers, my skin flaked away and my legs itched. I scratched at the dead skin until I was pink and sore. Then I got dressed again. I thought about the scientists who had vanished into a crevasse 20 years earlier and were never found. How their little bodies would one day tumble out of the glacier's mouth like babies being born, frozen solid and perfectly preserved in their brightly coloured thermals. People used to think that ice is white, but it isn't. There is all kinds of history inside it, waiting to be brought out. I'm going to leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. So there's lots of themes in the novel, and motherhood is one of them, and it's alluded to almost in the opening passage there, isn't it? Did you come to it thinking about that as a big theme, or did that come as you wrote?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about the book for a long time before I started writing it. So I started actually, putting the words on the page at the end of 2016, but I've been sort of thinking about the novel on and off since about 2011. And the theme of motherhood was one of the things that was really driving it from the off, I suppose. I guess, you don't really think about them as themes when you're writing them, do you? You think about them as kind of characters, but it was always that sort of mother-daughter relationship, or that complicated mother-daughter relationship. So in the book, Monster, who we meet at the start, is trying to make her way home to Northern England. And when she gets there, she finds a girl. And that's not too much of a spoiler because it is in the blurb on the back of the book. But she finds a girl, and a girl who is, in her words, kind of wild and uncivilized, and attempts to sort of basically civilize her or raise her. And she sort of does that in her own image. So she changes her own name to Mother, and she calls the girl Monster after herself. So already there's a kind of complex power thing going on there, with Monster trying to create young Monster in her own identity. And obviously, as anyone who has either had a daughter or been a daughter will know, you reach a certain age and you start to try and break free of your parents' identity, and or at least to kind of create your own identity within or outside of that. And obviously that's what young Monster eventually tries to do, which is where the rift comes in. So that kind of power dynamic was sort of central to the book, really, right from the start. I always had this idea of a kind of crossover of power sort of halfway through the book, where one person's power diminishes as the other's accelerating, and there comes there has to come a kind of a shifting point, a turning point, where the daughter character sort of takes on that power. And for me, I mentioned it's the retelling of Robinson Crusoe in some ways, so there's a colonial aspect there, but when you bring it down to kind of two characters, it also becomes about parenthood and motherhood and responsibility, and who has that responsibility and what we owe to each other as well. So yeah, that shift really was where the book started, which is kind of in the middle of the book, and then it kind of grew a bit like an hourglass, I suppose, sort of grew out from that central focus point in both directions.
Yeah. And in terms of what the book's essentially doing is exploring one thing that could happen, apocalyptic futures. We imagine all the different things and all the ways that we might behave. Did you intend to make it a really closely observed with just a couple of characters, or at any stage was it bigger? Were there more people in it, and did it pare down, or did you really decide at the beginning it's just going to be these two people?
It started with being just two people. I've always kind of loved theatre, and I love the sort of big showy kind of massive musicals with hundreds of people in the cast and all the rest of it, but I really love plays that are really, really focused, often in they're often performed in kind of very small studio theatres, very sparse set, and it's a real focus on one or two or three characters. And I knew that was what I wanted to write and what I wanted to bring to the novel as well. So to begin with, to be honest, the apocalypse bit was just an excuse to get these two characters on their own and have them having nowhere else they could turn to. That I think something that probably lockdown has taught a lot of us is that when you are spending time with just one other person or a couple of other people, everything becomes heightened. And in normal life, everything gets heightened, but we can go out and meet someone else for coffee, or we can phone someone up and offload. When there are only two people and you have no other options, then it becomes this kind of crucible where the characters are sort of forced to either confront each other or hide from each other. But the power dynamic can't be diluted down in any way.
Yeah.
And that I knew that was what I wanted to focus on. So I just had to come up with an excuse for getting rid of all the other characters in the world. And obviously, once I started writing it, the apocalypse bit, or the kind of endingness of it, became sort of central to the book and central to the characters, and it shaped the characters' personalities, and it shaped the world that the book was set in very, very quickly. But yeah, it was just about focusing on those two characters and really, really heightening the tension between them.
And it does work like a two-handed play, doesn't it? In that sense, as it does give you that way, and finding that way into two characters so closely, it's really interesting. Loneliness is the other thing, obviously, that comes up, and I know we keep saying we don't want to talk about the pandemic, but we're still in a pandemic. We're literally still in a pandemic this very moment, and you suddenly, me and my husband are starting to really get on each other's nerves. After 20 years together, these 2 weeks have been really hard. And that idea of loneliness and how Mother Monster starts to cope with it, and how that shifts, and how people can reflect to it now that we've actually kind of been through that ourselves, because I reread the book again. I read it before the pandemic and then I reread it after the pandemic. It's like, this really feels, it really hits, doesn't it? That idea of loneliness and what we might do if we found ourselves in that situation. And this is the first time in our lives we've found ourselves in something as dramatic as that, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think I mean it's been interesting hearing people's responses to the book, depending on when they've read it, and what people have picked up on. A lot of people in the sort of the pre-pandemic reading, I suppose, picked up on the kind of the sort of feminism aspect and of wanting to talk about that, and about the kind of the language aspect. There's a lot there about language, and then the sort of post-pandemic readings, a lot of them have been about this thing of loneliness and this idea of being isolated either on your own or with another person, which I think is completely understandable. I had this really weird experience when the hardback came out before the pandemic, and then the paperback came out kind of in deepest, darkest lockdown in January 2021. But in between that, the German and Italian versions came out, and they came out, I think, in something like March and April or March and May of 2020. So it was really kind of right at the height of the sort of everything happening, and everyone trying to work out how to come to terms with this pandemic that was sort of certainly just hitting Western Europe at that point, in a kind of big way. And so I got all these sort of emails from mostly German bloggers, actually, but German and Italian book bloggers, with kind of, the kind of Q&As that you answer. And a lot of them were sort of saying, how do you feel having predicted the pandemic? Do you have any advice for us now that we're in your novel? And I just felt really, I'm really sorry. I'll write something happy next time. But yeah, so I think you're always going to read a book based on the context that you're reading it in, aren't you? And hopefully the book has stood up to that. From what I've heard from a lot of people who've read it since, it has stood up to people's experiences. And it's interestingly, one of the sort of criticisms that was leveled at the book pre-pandemic was that the kind of before event, the kind of apocalypse event, wasn't one clear event. It's a kind of multitude of events. There's a sickness, and there's kind of war which causes sickness, which causes further war, which they kind of build on each other. And before the pandemic, I think a lot of people weren't comfortable with that. Since the pandemic, everyone who I've spoken to about it has gone, well, that's exactly what happens. If you look at how the pandemic affected supply lines, has affected, individual morale, has affected community, has, all the things that the knock-on effects, which isn't to say that I'm any kind of prophet, but but I think that's kind of one of the jobs of the writer, isn't it, to think about the what if.
Yeah.
And there's never one clear story, I think, as much as you'd like to make it one because it's easier for the narrative.
Well, it's a bit of a Hollywood ending, isn't it? A meteorite that obliterates everything, and
Yeah.
then because the idea of everything and nothing is almost easier to cope with than the in between, and that's where we found ourselves in the pandemic, and that's what the novel is. In a way, there's nobody else but your two characters, but there's an in between, isn't there, where there's life going on, but it's not the life that we recognise. We don't know how it's going to go, and that makes it really, really difficult to cope with. And I think in a way it is easier to cope with. It'll just be over. That'll be fine, but that's not how it goes at all, is it? That's, and like you say, like we're seeing now, just generally the rolling impact of the pandemic is it's absolutely not over, and there's a much wider and broader impact, and all the societal and political things that come in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the kind of fighting for resources that happens as well, and how all of that then has a knock-on effect with the natural world or the sort of semi-natural world, if you're looking at things like farming, the sort of the industrialized natural world as well. Yeah. And that was something that I was really keen on as well with the book. Was I really wanted a rural post-apocalyptic novel. I think so many novels that deal with some sort of apocalypse or ending, or however you want to frame it, take place in cities, which is completely understandable because I went to a talk with Bernardine Evaristo what feels like about a week ago, but was probably last year. But she was talking about cities as places where there are so many lives and there are so many characters that the opportunities for a writer are immense, because you constantly have people bumping up against people, and that's how stories are made. Which I absolutely kind of agree with and respect. But being from a rural background, the sense of community is very different somewhere rural. And I think that's something that we've seen over the last couple of years as well, is the ways that rural communities have coped and supported each other. And actually, the thing of, if you live somewhere rural, everyone knows everyone's business, which can be both a blessing and a curse. Yeah. There's kind of so much potential for story there as well, but also within that potential for survival, you have so much more kind of natural or sort of semi-natural resource if you live somewhere rural. I remember there was a sort of back at the start of the pandemic, when everyone was applying for Arts Council grants, to kind of emergency grants, to get you through the couple of weeks of the pandemic or whatever it was going to be at the time. One of the questions was about resilience, and there was a sort of thread of people on Twitter going, well, I planted some potatoes, does that count as resilience, like for the future? Does that count? I've got a vegetable patch. Yeah. And this idea of how we survive in the countryside, being maybe one step closer to the origins of things, than perhaps it is in the city. And that's a gross generalization, of course, but I think there's something in that lends itself to post-apocalyptic writing.
Definitely, in that sense, because I live in a rural, although I'm not from a rural setting, I'm from like an edgeland, which is kind of on the cusp of the countryside, but not quite. But I live in a rural village now, and the way that we talk a lot about how that we only think we coped with the pandemic is because we lived in a rural village and we had like space and community, and we weren't butted up against each other, and we already did a lot of those things like growing, and it didn't feel, it felt like if things got a lot worse, would somehow manage. Where had I been still living in a second floor flat in town, I've got no idea, how different that would have been. Something that just popped in my head, that when we were talking before this, that Sherston mentioned, was about the things that we do to cope. And this is something that it's not too much of a spoiler, but to cope. In the countryside, we quite often have fires. I've got a fire to heat my house and I have to burn things. There's book burning. There's book burning in your book.
There is, yeah. And again, it's about this thing of the necessity of things, what we need and what we don't need. And I mean, I write, I'm a writer. Of course, I believe in the necessity of stories in some kind of fundamental human way. But, in that moment, if you're cold and you need to light a fire and the only kind of thing you've got to start it with is a book, are you going to save the book or are you going to freeze? Yep. You're going to light the fire, aren't you? You're going to use the book to light the fire. And there is something quite joyous as well about reading that bit in libraries. Something that I have kind of taken great delight at and watched everyone kind of go, oh no. But yeah, and I think there's also something about kind of language as well, and about character. So, the character who's burning the books is Mother Monster, and she's very much a sort of functional person. She has a lot of the kind of functional in the sense of being pragmatic. She has a lot of the traits that actually a lot of people in a lot of protagonists in post-apocalyptic films and novels have, in that she's determined, she is kind of ruthless. She actually doesn't care that much about other people. She's very sort of self-driven and self-focused, and she is a pragmatist. And so for her, of course, there's no question that she would burn these books in order to keep herself warm. And interesting, what's come up quite a lot in kind of discussions of the book has been people, mostly men, I will say, saying that or asking why I made Mother Monster so unpleasant or so prickly or so feisty is another one, it's kind of sort of gender loaded words. that we have to describe essentially strong women. And then you think, well, you don't level that at the sort of Will Smith character who's toting a gun through an abandoned city. You don't level that at any of the kind of male survivor figures. It's only because she's a woman that those characteristics are seen as undesirable or unpleasant. And so the book burning thing is in a way another illustration of her character, and a way to perhaps contrast her with young Monster, who probably, had she been brought up pre-apocalypse, probably wouldn't do that and would hold more attachment towards story and the sort of the imagination. She's got a lot more imagination than Mother Monster does. So yeah, there's a kind of there's definitely a character thing there as well.
Yeah, that attachment as well. I think again it's something values that would in a post-apocalyptic world is the things that we value and we're attached to will inevitably have to change, and that kind of explores that. But also the way in this book, I'm going to look, because I think Sherson's question might be a little bit like what I'm about to say. Oh, hold on, I'll find it. There we go. Is there a conscious romanticism of frontier or survivalist life in the book? Reminded of reading and living Little House on the Prairie as a kid, and yeah, that kind of retraction back to a more simple life, which is a lot of people kind of look to during the pandemic. Everyone was growing things and thinking we're gonna live off the land, and I had dreams. I watch the Walking Dead, I watch Apocalypse. I was like, I hope I get to ride horses to go places. But is it like it's a romanticized vision, because actually the reality of it's totally different, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Little House on the Prairie thing's really interesting because I mean they're there, they're right there behind me, the Little House on the Prairie books somewhere on that shelf. And I actually had reread all of the Little House on the Prairie books just before I started writing the book. Coincidentally, I mean, not because of the book at all. But there's definitely something feeding into the book there as well. This thing of living off the land, and also how much you can live off the land versus how much you can't, how much you need to, obviously Little House on the Prairie, kind of trade and buy. In My Name is Monster, it's about sort of scavenging. So having said that, I didn't want to set it in a city, it's set kind of next to a city so that, I can use both worlds if I want to. And that the city is there to sort of be scavenged and provides a kind of dangerous hub as well. But yeah, I think there probably is something romanticized about it, or romanticized in that it's hopeful. I'm not going to give away the ending at all, but when I originally started thinking about the book, and probably when I started writing it as well, it wasn't a hopeful book. And then, everything that happened sort of at the end of 2016 and into 2017, all the sort of political stuff that was happening, I didn't want to write a hopeless book. I wanted to write something that had some element of hope and beauty and joy and tenderness about it. I wasn't interested in writing something that was completely bleak. And there are books that are completely bleak, and there are some amazing books that are completely bleak, which I love, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't what I kind of needed as a writer at that point, and I felt like it wasn't what readers needed at that point, and probably certainly isn't at the moment, actually. I think there's enough bleakness, isn't there? Which isn't to say obviously that there is bleakness in the novel. It's post-apocalyptic. It's not laugh a minute, but yeah, so there possibly is romanticization of the kind of the rural life, or the sort of rural possibility for survival. But I think possibly all books are maybe guilty of, or a lot of books are guilty of sort of romanticizing things. They're a kind of heart song, aren't they? If you're working on this for multiple years, it has to come from a place of love and a place of longing for something. So yeah, hopefully it's there's realism to it. It's not it's romanticized, but not at the expense of realism.
Yeah.
And not at the expense of, difficulty and sort of all the other kind of narrative techniques like character tension and kind of obstacles that characters have to face and all the other things.
And obviously people bring their experience to it as well. So people who maybe do live a life like that might be like, that would be hard. Or if until I tried to grow things, I just thought it was easy as anything, and then you're like, actually, it'd be quite tricky. But it brings that like jeopardy to it, and especially that sense of the survival and the scavenging. With scavenging, we know it's going to run out. So there's all, it's going to run out at some point, isn't it? So she has to develop some kind of skill.
Yeah, and there is physical labor in the book as well. It's not sort of, you look at a patch of soil and it grows. There's a lot of that. There is a lot of physical labor, and part of that is about dampening some of that romanticism, or sort of acknowledging the sort of bodily effort that it takes to survive. And part of that is also about how we relate to our own bodies, particularly in this kind of scenario where you have to rely on your body. Your body is doing the physical work, and I'm someone who works. My job is mostly brain based. It's not physically bodily, in that way. But actually, if you're in a survival situation, the body does a lot of work. The body is what's mending the walls, is what's planting, is what's plowing and harvesting, and kind of painting up the windows so they don't rot and the wind gets in. All the sort of those jobs. There has to be a sort of focus on the body in that sense as well.
Would now be a good time to look at the next character and do another wee reading?
Yeah, it would. So the second character is also called Monster. That is why the book is in first person. It's hard enough when you have two characters of the same gender. When they both have the same name, third person becomes impossible. But that sort of first person thing allowed me to focus on that kind of turn at the center of the book. So again, I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler. Sorry if it is. But so the turn at the center of the book is where the kind of power shifts between the two characters, but it's also where the voice shifts as well. So the first half is all told from the perspective of Mother Monster, and the second half is all told from the perspective of young Monster. So I'm going to give you the start of young Monster's section, which comes about halfway through the book. And it's a sort of introduction to herself. My name is Monster. I'm small and bony like a blackbird. My feet turn in when I walk, and there is nearly always dust in my knuckles. My hair is thick and dark. When I sweat, it sticks down the back of my neck and I can feel it clinging there. Mother says I'm like water. You can't grab hold of water. It has nothing to grip onto. It goes where it wants to, like a thought, except that thoughts can run uphill and water can't. There's nothing true about water. It fills the shape of whatever bowl or cup or tin you put it in. I think what Mother means when she says that I am like water is that I am good at filling the shape I am supposed to fill. What I mean is, Mother cups her hands and I lay myself in them, and she thinks that is the shape I am. And I do try to be that shape, the way Mother wants me to be. I try, but I'm not very good at it.
Thank you. So it's coming to, one of the other themes is fitting in, isn't it? And both monsters don't fit in and never have really, have they? Especially as we learn more about Mother Monster, we find out that she's never been what people expected of her.
Yeah, and that's sort of kind of goes back to this thing of the qualities that a person needs to survive, and certainly the qualities the person needs to be the only survivor. And a lot of those qualities are things that possibly don't serve us in everyday social situations, but would serve you if you were the only person, the only person left alive. The guy that Robinson Crusoe is based on is a guy called Alexander Selkirk, who was shipwrecked for I forget how many years, but in fact, no, that's a lie. He wasn't shipwrecked. I think I remember reading somewhere that he basically got so annoyed with everyone on the ship that he asked to be set ashore, and set himself ashore and survived on this island for I don't know how many years. And that's the guy that the story of Robinson Crusoe is based on. And obviously, My Name is Monster is the kind of retelling of Robinson Crusoe. So that's a sort of ultimate example of really not working well in social situations, but being very capable of surviving on your own. It's interesting because a couple of people, since the book has come out, have asked me whether Mother Monster is autistic and whether I wrote her as autistic. And I didn't particularly, but I'm really happy that if that's how people read her, that there's a kind of representation there. But again, I think it's about that thing of seeing a person who, not necessarily who doesn't fit in, but who operates differently, and who sees the world in a different way than is perhaps always encouraged by society at large. And that's very much Mother Monster. And a lot of those qualities that in the sort of flashback scenes, her all right prickliness, as it were, her feistiness, excuse me, or her lack of caring about other people. That's what enables her to survive, is that she doesn't do what everyone else does and cluster to be close to those around her. She stays out on her own, and that actually serves her very well and means that she doesn't get the sickness, and she isn't in a kind of cluster of people when the war breaks out, and therefore is away from kind of bombing targets. And excuse me, I'm living my own sickness now. It's and those things that are seen as negative qualities become positive qualities when it comes to surviving. So I guess there is a lot about not fitting in, and I think a lot of writers have that as well. As a writer, it can be really useful to be not on the outside but sort of on the edges and observing things. and so maybe we write that into our characters as well.
So in terms of how you got started with the book, you said you started writing it in 2016, but you were part of a scheme that helped you turn it into a novel, weren't you? Are you all right?
Sorry, yeah. No, you're right. I'm about 90% lemon and ginger at the moment. As I said, I had the idea for the book since about 2011, and I've been carrying it around with me, and sort of building on it and thinking about it when I was driving to work and all the rest of it. But I basically convinced myself that I wasn't allowed to write it because I was a poet, and if I wrote a novel, I was therefore less of a poet somehow. And I had this weird sort of, not quite a purist idea, but this idea that I needed to put myself in a box and dedicate myself to this one thing, and if I wrote anything outside of that box, then I was somehow damaging the poetness, which I hasten to add is not something that I agree with at all now. And then what sort of changed that really was in 2016, Penguin Random House created their Right Now program, Right Now with a WR, as in right now, which was a mentoring scheme for underrepresented writers, and it was this kind of amazing scheme where you could apply, and 150 people who applied would get to go on what they called an insight day, where you'd hear from agents and publishers and writers and essentially get insight into how publishing works as an industry. And on that day, you'd get a 10-minute one-to-one with the Penguin Random House editor, who would look at, I think it was 5,000 words of your work. And then of those 150 people, I think it was 12 would receive a year of mentoring from an editor at Penguin Random House. And I just thought this was just an amazing opportunity and something that I really wanted to apply for, and would be incredible to do in terms of my career and my writing. But they didn't want poetry. They wanted fiction or non-fiction. But they only wanted 1,000 words. So I basically thought, well, I've got this novel in my head. I can write the first 1,000 words. All I need to do is just not watch Netflix for one night. I'll write this first 1,000 words. I'll send it off to them. And if it's any good, if they take me on the first 150, I'll think about writing the rest of the book.
Yeah.
So I wrote the first 1,000 words, sent them off. On the form, there was a little box that said, how much of your novel have you written so far? And I thought I'd written 961 words at that point. I was like, there's no way I can put that. They won't take me seriously. So I thought, all right, well, how much of the book do I think I can get written by the time they need to see anything else? So very optimistically put 13,500 words.
Nice.
Sent my form off and thought, right, well, off it goes. Heard back and got onto the kind of 150 people, and basically thought, right, well, they need to see another 5,000 words now, so I better start writing. So I wrote that, sent that off, and that was the middle section of the book was what I sent off to them, that kind of switch between the voices. And then I think by the time I went on the actual day, I had about 20 something thousand words. And then, they selected me. I got through to the shortlist and had to send them basically everything I had. And then got through to the final mentoring program and was mentored for a year by Tom Avery, who's an editor at Heinemann. And yeah, it was incredible because it's so rare in the publishing industry to have that level of editorial support, not just through the kind of initial writing, but just through the first draft. It's so rare for an editor to look at your work before it's even finished, when you're writing fiction, certainly. It just, it doesn't happen. Your work normally needs to be completely finished and polished and gone through umpteen drafts before it even gets to an agent, and then it gets to an editor. So that was incredibly useful for me because I basically didn't know what I was doing. I'd never written a novel before, and I treated it like a giant poem, really. So the book's quite fragmentary. So I don't know if you can sort of see this, but like there's one section and another section, and there's some quite short bits. And I basically approached each of those sections as sort of stanzas in a poem.
Yeah.
And some events in the book, happen chronologically, but there are also flashbacks and other sections that could kind of move around a bit. So I did what I would do with a poetry collection. I pushed all my furniture to the side of the room and laid out the novel scene by scene and physically moved bits of it around. Basically gave what I had to my editor, and he really helped me through that process and helped me understand things like narrative structure and character development and all those things which you have a sort of intrinsic knowledge of if you're a reader, but don't always know the words to describe, or don't always know, you know what you're doing, but you don't always know the why of, kind of why you're doing it. And he was incredibly supportive throughout that process and the rewriting process as well. And also in getting me my agent, who then went on to sell the book for me to Canongate. So yeah, it was an incredible experience, and it's something that I would absolutely recommend. Yeah. If you're eligible, apply for it. If there are similar things with different eligibility, apply for those. It's incredible to have that support.
So that's My Name is Monster, which is still out in paperback now, can be bought in all good bookshops. What's next for you with your writing? Obviously you're a poet as well, but what else are you working on at the minute?
So I'm working on 2 books at the moment, which is maybe not wise, but there we are. One is a poetry collection, which I've been working on actually probably I started probably about a month earlier than I started My Name is Monster. So it's kind of long game, which is exploring the women in my family over kind of 400 years. And that's a poetry collection. And then I'm working on a second novel, which I haven't got an elevator pitch down for at all yet. So but it's different to My Name is Monster in a lot of ways. It's set in Antarctica. It's set kind of 70 years in the future, but it's again, it's got quite a concise cast of characters, and it's hopefully got that kind of focused feel, that kind of focused kind of crucible feel as well. So hopefully more of that in the weeks and months to come.
And in terms of, I'll just go back to what we talked about was hope in writing, which I think, like you say, it's something that I write quite bleak stuff, but there is this that I've recently rewritten the end of my book with a hopeful ending, because I think the last 2 years have just made me think I need something. I need something to cling on to. What kind of thing have you read anything recent? What are you reading that's got like a hopeful kind of outlook at the minute? Have you read anything like that? Or
Oh,
sorry, I sprung that one
no,
on you.
it's really interesting because as soon as you say what have you read that's hopeful, the things that come to me are the things that are bleak.
But there can be hope in that though, can't there? Like I read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is incredibly bleak, but there's so much love in it. It's such a
Yeah,
close study of love and relationships and people that there is hope in it, isn't there? So
that was actually the first book that came to mind. But yeah, and I don't know if it's about hope, but there's certainly love in there, if not
yeah.
necessarily hope. Actually, I've just recently read There Are More Things by Yara Rodriguez Fowler, which is somewhere, the big yellow one there. I'm pointing backwards there. Which is I think is very hopeful. There's a lot in there about revolution. It's a very kind of revolutionary book, and also quite poetic in the way that it uses language on the page. Kind of reminds me of the Bernardine Evaristo book Girl, Woman, Other, in the way that it does that sort of with language and the kind of and that's a kind of city story actually of characters bumping up against each other in cities. But yeah, that's one I'd recommend.
Yeah. And the last thing I'm going to ask you, which is a bit of a weird one, but say it was you in the apocalypse, what do you think you would do? Do you think you'd
Oh,
be like living off the land or hiding in some posh hotel in a city?
I don't know. I'd be here when it happened. I did an event when the book first came out with Hannah Jameson, who wrote The Last, and the premise of that is that the main character is away on a conference in a hotel when the apocalypse happens. And she was sort of saying how everyone's apocalypse plans always revolve around you being in your own home when it happens. So yeah, I would hope I was at home. I remember when I was writing the book, actually sitting at my kitchen table and kind of looking around my kitchen and going, how long could I survive for if everything stopped, there were no shops, nothing, and I just had to be in this house in a lockdown, as it were. And I reckoned I had about 4.5 weeks worth of not dying, assuming that I still had electricity and water. Yeah, but very quickly the food was going to become dry pasta or porridge made just with water and boring. But yeah, I don't know what I'd do after that first month. I think I'd probably be okay-ish for the first month and then start to struggle maybe.
Well, I'm just looking. Thank you so much. I think we should wrap up so we can both go back to our little COVID isolation nap spaces. Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting to you. We know each other. It's always lovely chatting, but it's been really nice to chat about the book with you, which I've never managed to do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
That's all right. And thanks everyone for coming. Check out the rest of the Crossing the T's festival events that are happening until next weekend, and enjoy the rest of your day. And hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you.